Okay, so you want to own a Viking longship. You picture the dragon prow cutting through morning fog, shields racked along the hull, oars biting the water in one motion, and silver stacked in the bilge on the way home. Then you open the numbers. September 1066. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, sails for England with a fleet of roughly 300 ships and somewhere between 9,000 and 15,000 men. 5 days after his first victory outside York, his army is annihilated at Stamford Bridge. The survivors need 24 ships to carry them home. 300 ships sailed out, 24 sailed back. That is the part the saga saves for the last verse. And it is the part that actually decides whether this business makes you rich or gets you killed. We're going below the waterline and into the accounts. We'll build one large longship from a felled oak, crew it, provision it, launch it, and follow the silver until we know whether the owner comes home wealthy or doesn't come home at all. First, the name needs sorting out, the same way tavern needed sorting out. The ship you're picturing, the raiding dragon with the carved prow, is one member of a whole family of vessels the Norse built for different jobs. A gnar, spelled Knarr, is a broad-bellied cargo hauler built to carry wool and walrus ivory and timber, not to win a fight. What you're buying is the other kind, a longship built for speed under oar and sail alike, able to land on any beach without a harbor. Reconstructions like the Skoldelev II wreck, rebuilt in the 2000s as the ship called Sea Stallion, run about 30 meters long, under 4 meters wide, with room for 60 rowers and a maximum load pushing 100 people. It weighs a little over 9 tons empty and can still carry 6 tons of cargo. This is not a rowboat with some shields tied to the side. It is a warship, a troop transport, and a cargo hold that happens to also be the fastest thing on the North Sea. Before you own any of that, someone has to build it, and this is where the size of the investment becomes obvious. Experimental archaeologists, reconstructing ships at this scale, using period tools and techniques, have put the labor at somewhere between 27,000 and 40,000 working hours for the hull alone. One estimate puts the full project, hull, rigging, and sail at the surplus labor of around 100 people for a year. Let's set our yardstick now, the way we measured the tavern in carpenter days. In the Viking world, wealth was counted in cattle before it was counted in coin. The Old Norse word for wealth, fe, is the same word for livestock. So, we'll measure this business in oxen. An ordinary ox cost about 2 silver or That's the Old Norse coin, spelled O-R-E with an accent, but we'll just say ora going forward. A thrall, a human being held as property, cost about 12 ora, 6 oxen. Keep both numbers in your head, we'll need them. The hull starts with timber, and the timber has to be right. The Sea Stallion reconstruction needed 14 oak trees, each about a meter across, selected and felled individually, with curved branches cut from the crown so the natural bend of the wood could be used for the ship's ribs instead of being wasted. Then come the rivets. The Gokstad ship, one of the best preserved originals ever excavated, holds around 5,000 individual iron rivets, each one hand-forged, each one driven through overlapping planks in the clinker style that gives these ships their flex and their speed. That's somewhere between 100 and 150 kilograms of iron, and every gram of it came from bog ore, smelted in small furnaces, hammered and folded and hammered again by a blacksmith who could do nothing else with his year. Then the sail. Textile researchers estimate a sail large enough for a 30-meter ship needed about 2 tons of wool, the annual clip of roughly 700 sheep, and that 2 skilled women working full-time needed close to a year to spin, weave, and treat it. Before you have loaded a single shield aboard, you have already spent the surplus labor of a small village, and unlike the tavern's landlord, there is no Winchester College here absorbing that cost for you. In the world this ship comes from, the person who builds it usually owns it outright, which means every one of those hours and every one of those ox equivalents sits on your books from day one. Except, often, it doesn't work quite that simply, either, because Scandinavian kings figured out early that they didn't need to own every ship themselves. They needed ships to exist when called for, so they built a system called the leidang, the levy. The coastline was divided into districts called ship districts, and each district was legally obligated to build, crew, and provision one standardized vessel, typically 20 to 25 pairs of oars, whether the local farmers wanted a ship that year or not. In 13th century Norway, there were 279 of these districts. This is the tavern's fixed rent, dressed in Norse. The king doesn't ask whether your harvest was good or whether anyone in the district particularly wants to go raiding this summer. The obligation exists on the district the way £8 a year existed on the Angel Inn, regardless of excuses. You can be an individual owner outside that system too, a wealthy farmer or a local chieftain with enough land to build his own ship without waiting for royal orders. But the underlying economics don't change. Either way, someone has to feed the ship's other appetite, people. A large longship needs 60 to 80 rowers at minimum, more for the biggest vessels, plus a steersman, who functions as captain and navigator. Under the levy system, the district's households supplied these men in rough proportion to their land and wealth, the same way Winchester College's tenant supplied labor from his own family and hired hands. Outside the levy, a chieftain, assembling a raiding or trading crew, drew on his own dependents, tenant farmers, and, frequently, thralls. Remember our yardstick. One thrall costs 6 oxen. A crew of 80 free men, eating, drinking, and expecting a share of whatever the voyage brings home, is an entirely different cost structure than a crew partly staffed with people you already own outright. And Norse society ran on exactly that mixture, uncomfortable as it is to say plainly. Most of your rowers are also, for 11 months of the year, farmers. Raiding season runs spring to early autumn, precisely so everyone can be home in time for harvest, which tells you something the sagas don't say directly. This was never anyone's only job. It was a seasonal, capital-intensive side venture layered on top of subsistence agriculture, the same way your household ran the tavern's stores, brewing, and stables all at once. There's also a purely financial structure for spreading that risk, one that survives in the written sources under its own name, the feilag, literally fellowship, a partnership where multiple investors pool silver, goods, or ship shares into a joint venture and split what comes back according to their stake. If you don't want to bet your entire fortune on one voyage, you buy a fraction of someone else's ship and someone else's risk. It is, in the plainest sense, available to a 10th century Norwegian, a joint stock arrangement. Now, the supply chain, because a longship eats constantly, even sitting at the dock, iron for rivets and replacement fittings, wool and tar for waterproofing the hull, reapplied regularly because clinker planking works loose and needs recaulking, food and water for the crew, calculated for a voyage of unknown length because the North Sea does not run on a schedule. Spare oars, spare rope, a spare sail if you can afford one, because losing your only sail mid-voyage doesn't mean a bad quarter. It means the crew doesn't come home. Buy too little, and a storm off the Shetlands leaves 80 men adrift. Buy too much, and you've sunk silver into stores that spoil in the hold before you ever leave harbor. This is the same knife edge as the tavern's ale and the bathhouse's firewood, except the penalty for guessing wrong isn't a bad night's takings. It's the ship. So, revenue. The obvious answer, the one every saga leads with, is plunder. It is also the least reliable line on the ledger, and the reason becomes obvious the moment you look at what a raid actually pays. When Danish and Norwegian fleets extorted the English crown directly, rather than fighting for scraps, village by village, the numbers are staggering and well recorded. In 991, after the Battle of Malden, King Ethelred paid roughly 10,000 pounds of silver, something over 3,700 kilograms, simply to make a fleet go away. By 1012, that single payment had risen to 48,000 pounds, nearly 18,000 kilograms. In 1016, the final settlement ran past 72,000 pounds, over 26,000 kilograms, before local London silver on top of it. This is the danegeld, and it tells you something important. Raiding for movable loot from villages and monasteries was a beginner's game. The real money was in becoming frightening enough at scale that a king would rather pay you to leave. But even the danegeld thins out fast once it's divided. Historians estimate the 991 payment alone, roughly 3,500 kilograms of silver, had to be split across a fleet of around 3,000 men. Work the arithmetic, and each ordinary warrior walked away with something close to half a kilogram of silver, a little over an ox's worth. For a season's danger, the captains and the ship owners, the men who fronted the vessel and organized the fellowship, took a far larger cut. The oarsman took home an ox. The owner took home a fortune. That gap is the entire business. Below plunder and tribute sits a darker, steadier revenue line. People. Captives taken in raids on Ireland, England, and the Slavic and Baltic coasts fed a trade network running east through the ports of Hedeby and Burka down the Volga River into the markets of the Islamic world, where they were exchanged for silver coins by the tens of thousands. A single hoard on the island of Gotland, deposited sometime after 870, contained over 66 kilograms of silver and more than 14,000 individual coins, and it is one of dozens found across Scandinavia. At roughly 9 of those coins to 1 ora and 12 ora to a thrall, you can watch the exchange rate work in real time. A person converts into coin, the coin converts into land, cattle, and ships back home, and the whole eastern trade route exists largely to make that conversion efficient. This is the least comfortable line item in the entire business, and it was also, by the archaeological record, one of the largest. Then comes the revenue stream that actually built lasting fortunes, and it looks nothing like raiding at all. Trade and tribute, run on a schedule instead of a raid. We have a direct account of exactly how this worked, because a Norwegian named Ottar, from the far north of Norway, sailed south around the year 890 and described his own finances to King Alfred of Wessex in person. Ottar didn't lead with plunder, he led with reindeer, 600 of them, tame, plus tribute in furs and hides collected annually from the Sami people to the north, a fixed arrangement, not a one-time raid. He hunted walrus for their ivory, which he brought as gifts to a foreign king, and for their hide, which made superior ships rope. He described killing 60 walrus in 2 days with a crew of 5, then sailing the goods south to trading towns to sell them. His ship was not a weapon that occasionally carried cargo. It was a cargo vessel that occasionally needed to defend itself. He never once, in the entire account, describes a raid. He describes routes, tribute schedules, and trading towns. That is how you actually got rich owning a Norse ship, not from a single glorious season of plunder, but from turning the vessel into infrastructure for a repeatable trade network. The exact move Julia Felix made with her baths and shops. The exact move Richard Kingsmill made with his inn. The ship is the anchor, the tribute and the trade routes are where the money lives. Legally, all of this sat inside a real framework, not a lawless free-for-all. Later, Norwegian law codes spell out precisely what equipment a farmer of a given wealth had to provide to the levy, down to helmet, mail, shield, spear, and sword for the well-off, lighter gear for the poor, and the value of a human life was itself a fixed, published number. The compensation a killer's family owed to avoid a blood feud ran to roughly 5 kilograms of silver for a free man. 10 times what you'd pay for the thrall standing next to him. Killing the wrong person on a raid wasn't just a moral problem, it was a liability on the balance sheet, payable in silver, and men who couldn't pay it usually paid in kind instead. Now, what breaks the business? Because a ship fails in ways an inn and a bathhouse never have to worry about. A leaking roof is an expense. A drowned crew is not recoverable at any price. The catastrophic risk here isn't gradual, the way a bad harvest slowly squeezes a tavern's margin. It's binary. The North Sea in a bad autumn simply ends ships, cargo, and crew together, and there's no partial failure state, no slow arrears building up in a rent ledger. Storms are the leading cause, unglamorous and undocumented by name in most cases, simply implied by the ships that never made a saga because nobody came home to write one. But we do have one documented catastrophic case at a scale you can actually count: Stamford Bridge. 300 ships crossed the North Sea with Harald Hardrada in September of 1066. 5 days after landing, his army was destroyed. 24 ships carried the survivors home. That's a roughly 92% loss of the fleet's capacity to ever sail again, sitting inside a single afternoon on top of the king's own death and the deaths of most of his household troops. Every investor who had put silver into that expedition lost it completely. There is no rent remission for a fleet that isn't coming back. There's a quieter version of the same risk that shows up constantly in the record without a battle at all. A raid that simply doesn't pay. You outfit 60 men, feed them for a season, cross open water, and find the monastery already stripped by an earlier fleet, or the coast defended or the wind wrong for weeks. The oxen you spent on iron and wool and provisions don't come back just because the voyage was disappointing. Compare that to a good season and the swing is brutal. A modest raiding voyage might return, after the crew's shares, something in the range of a few dozen ox equivalents of profit for the owner. A genuinely good one, a fleet large enough to extract tribute at scale, could return hundreds. A bad one returns nothing, and you've still spent the iron, the wool, and if it goes as badly as Stamford Bridge, the crew. So who actually got rich? Consistently, it wasn't the loudest raider in the sagas. It was Adar, converting tribute and trade into reindeer herds and standing wealth. It was the ship-owning chieftain who ran his vessel through a fellowship, taking a captain's share of several voyages instead of betting everything as an oarsman on one. It was the man who treated the levy obligation as a floor to meet, not a ceiling to stop at. Using the same ship, the king required him to build for trading voyages the rest of the year. The pattern is identical to the tavern and the bathhouse. The fortune sits with whoever turns the core asset into a repeatable system, not with whoever extracts the most from any single trip. Could you get rich owning a Viking LongShip? Yes. But the rating is the least dependable part of the answer. Run it as a smash-and-grab operation, and you may come home once with real silver, or you may not come home at all. Run it as Adar ran his, as a floating trade route with fixed tribute at one end and a market at the other, and the ship becomes exactly what the levy system always assumed it was. Infrastructure, not adventure. Misjudge the sea, the crew, or the season, and your name may survive the way most of Harald Hardrada's men survive today. Not in a saga, in the gap between 300 ships and 24.